August 1945, the heat over Luzon shimmered like glass. A line of captured Japanese women nurses, clerks, and radio aides stepped through the camp gate, carrying torn satchels and exhaustion that smelled of salt and fear. The bamboo huts ahead were silent except for the squeak of a rusted pulley and, somewhere inside, a sharp crack. That made everyone flinch. For a second they thought it was gunfire. Another crack, followed louder this time, and then a burst of laughter, bright and alien. They had expected interrogation, shouting, humiliation. Instead, they found something stranger, Americans laughing in the open sun. One guard tossed a white sphere high into the air. Another caught it with a glove's soft thud. To these women, the sound echoed the war itself impact. Full silence. We expected guns, not laughter. One nurse later wrote in her diary, "The camp smelled of dust and canned meat." A flag moved in slow waves above the guard tower. Every step the women took felt watched, measured, catalogued. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared at their own shadows on the dirt. Behind them the Pacific glimmered, proof that the empire they'd served had vanished. Reports estimate nearly 3,000 Japanese women were held and allied, administered camps across the Pacific, classified as low-risk prisoners. Yet in those first hours, every smile from an American felt like another trap. At dusk, the sound returned. Crack, cheer, laughter, the women ducked instinctively. One dropped her canteen, but then came a shout. Safe, and applause. Through the fence they saw the impassable. American soldiers playing a game. No orders, no marching, just men chasing a ball under the same sky where bombers once roared. When darkness fell, the women huddled in their hut. Someone whispered, "They play while we starve." Another voice answered softly, "Maybe they play because they lived." Outside, the last echo of the ball meeting, the bat, drifted across the compound, blending with the night insects. None of them knew that this simple sound, half violence, half joy, would soon become the bridge between enemy and human. By morning, one young nurse would rise before the others, drawn again by that rhythm of bat and cheer, curiosity stronger than fear. The next morning broke with a sound that split the silence crack, so clean and sharp it made every head inside the bamboo hut snap up. For a heartbeat, they thought the Americans had decided to execute someone. A second crack followed, then another, layered with something stranger. Cheering, clapping, even laughter. Through a slit in the hut wall, the young nurse who'd woken early saw them. American soldiers in undershirts, dust flying around their boots, a white ball flashing in the air like a piece of the sun. Fear rippled through the hut. Gunfire. Someone whispered. The nurse shook her head. "No, it's different." But their bodies didn't trust the difference. For 3 years they'd been trained to drop at every explosive sound, to flinch before thinking. The habit didn't vanish with surrender. The baseball smacked into a glove again thud, and several women ducked instinctively to the floor. Across the yard, one American laughed so hard he bent double. Another shouted, "Strike two," words that meant nothing to the women watching. To them, every movement looked like ritual: wind, swing, hit, shout, applause. It was chaos with no punishment. That was the first true culture shock. Historical reports note that by late 1945, U.S. Army morale divisions had shipped more than 200 Zero sports kits, including baseball gear, to camps across the Pacific. Games were part of a quiet experiment in resocialization, but for the prisoners, those first sounds felt like ghosts of war still hiding in daylight. It sounded like death. One later recalled, but they were only playing. The nurse kept watching. A ball flew past the catcher, rolled close to the fence, and stopped inches from the women's side. Dust spiraled up from the impact, catching the morning light. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then an American soldier walked toward the fence, smiling. An expression so casual it confused her more than any command could. He pointed at the ball. She didn't move. He pointed again, slower this time. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The women behind her whispered for her to stay still, but curiosities, more dangerous, human began to outweigh the fear. She took one slow step toward the fence, and that was when everything truly began to change. The ball rested in the dirt, white, scuffed, breathing in sunlight. On the other side of the fence, the American soldier stood motionless, his glove hanging loose by his leg. The young Japanese nurse looked at him, then at the ball. Her pulse drummed. In training, she'd been taught that hesitation could mean dishonor. But here, in this strange camp where laughter replaced orders, she wasn't sure what honor even meant anymore. The soldier raised a hand, palm open, gesturing lightly toward the ball. No shouting, no threat, just a silent invitation. For a few seconds, even the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, with her heart hammering, she crouched and picked it up. It was heavier than she'd expected, rough with red stitching, warm from the sun. She had never seen anything like it. Across the field, a few Americans cheered softly. The soldier smiled, not mockingly, but like he was greeting an old friend. He lifted his glove and pantomimed a slow throwing motion, then pointed to her. The women behind her whispered urgently, "Don't, it's a trick." But something in that man's easy stance felt disarming. She mimicked the motion clumsily, hesitated, and then threw. The ball sailed crooked, wobbling through the air, hit the ground halfway, and rolled to his feet. He laughed, not cruelly but kindly. A ripple of confused laughter escaped the Japanese women too, the first sound of release in months. Records from Allied archives mention that Red Cross personnel encouraged informal recreation within weeks of Japan's surrender. It wasn't official policy. It was humanity leaking through the cracks of bureaucracy. In that moment, the baseball wasn't a sport. It was translation without language. The soldier picked up the ball and this time tossed it softly back. It bounced once, twice, and stopped again at the fence. The women stared at it as though it might explode. But the nurse, heart racing, picked it up again, dusted it with her sleeve, and smiled for the first time since surrender. Behind her, someone murmured, "Why would they give us anything?" And no one answered. The question hung in the heat. The sound of another crack came from the far diamond, followed by a cheer that didn't sound foreign anymore. Tomorrow, that same nurse would cross one step closer to the fence. By the next morning, the rhythm of crack, cheer, crack had become part of the camp's heartbeat. The women no longer ducked at every sound, only flinched, then halves, mild at their own reflex. The young nurse woke early again, drawn by that same strange pull. Outside, the sun was already high, turning the barbed wire into lines of light. A baseball rolled toward the fence once more, kicked by accident. This time, no guard shouted. Instead, the same American from yesterday called out softly, "Throw it back." His tone carried no authority, just an easy warmth that felt out of place among uniforms. The nurse hesitated. Behind her, two older women whispered, "Ignore him." But curiosity, the small rebellion of the defeated, won. She stepped closer, her bare feet pressed into the dry soil. She bent, picked up the ball, and threw. It tumbled awkwardly, landing halfway before bouncing off the dirt and reaching his glove. A few soldiers clapped. One whistled. The laughter that followed was gentle, almost protective. For the prisoners, laughter had always meant mockery or cruelty. But this sounded different, like permission to breathe. Historical records show that by 1945, over 90% of American POW camps maintained sports fields, often encouraged by Red Cross and morale officers. Baseball was considered a symbol of normalcy, a way to humanize both sides. The idea worked here in ways no one expected. The American pointed at the diamond chalked into the dirt. He mimed swinging a bat, then gestured again. "Your turn." She shook her head quickly, cheeks burning, and backed away. He just nodded, still smiling, as if saying maybe next time. That tiny exchange rippled through the women later. Around the cooking fire that night, they spoke of the strange kindness, the game without weapons. Maybe it's how they train their soldiers. Someone joked weakly. The nurse didn't laugh. She kept thinking about that ball, that moment of trust no one had ordered her to give. The next morning, when the soldiers returned to the field, she would already be standing near the fence, waiting, not hiding. And for the first time she would see what they were actually playing. Morning heat shimmered across the camp, bending the air like water. The nurse stood by the fence, waiting without pretending otherwise. Across the yard, the Americans were drawing lines in the dust with a stick. One long, one short, a square, then another. Bases. The soldier from before waved her closer and pointed toward the open space just inside the wire. A pause, then the guard at the gate nodded once. The nurse stepped through for the first time since her capture. The ground felt different on this side, softer somehow. A soldier handed her the ball, gestured to swing an invisible bat. She laughed nervously, not knowing what he wanted. He pointed to his chest. Watch, he mouthed. He stepped back, lifted a real bat, swung, and the sharp crack echoed off the huts. The ball soared, and the nurse gasped. It wasn't violin. It was precision, sound, and joy wrapped together. She mimed the same swing, clumsy but determined. The men clapped, one knelt, chalking a mark where her feet should be. Another rolled the ball gently toward her. She swung again, missed completely, but everyone laughed, even her. Something light began to break inside her chest, something she didn't recognize as hope yet. Records show that by the end of 1945, U.S. military supply chains had delivered over 15,000 baseball bats to Pacific postings. It wasn't strategy, it was therapy. Baseball had become the strange language through which enemies found rhythm. The nurse tried again. Her third swing connected barely. The ball dribbled across the dirt. Still, the soldiers cheered as if she'd hit it over the ocean. She smiled, wide and startled, then bowed instinctively. They applauded louder. The other Japanese women watching through the wire joined in uncertain laughter. For a moment hierarchy dissolved, the war, the surrender, the guilt, all suspended in the lazy arc of a thrown ball. They taught us with gestures, not orders. One POW, you later recalled. That line would echo years later in documentaries and letters, but here it was just sweat, dust, and a human heartbeat that refused to stay silent. As the sun lowered, the nurse glanced back at the fence. More women were gathering now, eyes wide, unsure. Tomorrow some of them would step inside too. By the third afternoon, the sound of laughter had become the new language of the camp. Where once there had been commands and numbers, now there were cheers, claps, and the rhythm of gloves snapping shut. The nurse was no longer alone inside the fence. Half a dozen women had joined her, each one cautious at first, then slowly drawn in by the strange pull of the game. The Americans divided the field loosely. No teams, no sides. One soldier pitched, another caught, and the rest scattered around, calling encouragement across the dust. The Japanese women mimicked their movements, stumbling into giggles when they missed. Every mistake drew more laughter, not punishment. It was contagious. The nurse noticed something she hadn't seen since the surrender, faces unguarded, shoulders relaxed. She swung, hit nothing, but when she looked up, one of the Americans clapped anyway. Another walked forward, raised his palm through the air, an unfamiliar gesture. Unsure what to do, she hesitated. He laughed softly, then touched his own hand to his chest and said, "Good." She repeated it, awkwardly smiling. It was their first word shared without translation. U.S. Army reports later described visible emotional relief, spreading through camps that allowed sport or music. Psychologists at the time called it rehumanization by repetition, each harmless act a counterpoint to years of dehumanization. Here, it was working. The fence that once divided captor and captive now cast thinner shadows. A guard leaned on his rifle, grinning as a Japanese woman dropped the bat and doubled over laughing. Somewhere near the huts, a harmonica joined the rhythm, faint but insistent. The scene felt impossible. Soldiers and prisoners, enemies a month ago, now sharing the same dust and sunlight like neighbors. I forgot the war for a heartbeat. One woman would later write, "For that heartbeat, the war truly did vanish." There were no orders, no victory, no loss, only the sound of a ball meeting wood and people remembering how to laugh again. As the sun dipped low, the game faded. The soldiers collected the balls, the women returned to their huts, faces flushed with something new. Yet in the quiet that followed, one truth lingered. Tomorrow would bring the memory of guilt, heavy and uninvited. Night returned heavier than the day's laughter. Inside the bamboo hut, the air smelled of wet canvas and ration rice. The nurse sat cross-legged on her cot, a candle flickering beside her, the baseball lying just under her blanket like a secret she wasn't ready to confess. Around her, other women whispered jokingly about the game, trying to fit the day into a world that still made no sense. But when the talk faded, silence pressed in again, the silence of remembering who they were before the game began. She opened the small notebook she had hidden since surrender. The pages were creased, filled with neat kanji lines of a life that now felt like fiction. Tonight, she wrote carefully, "They laughed when I missed. I laughed too." Her hand trembled halfway through the sentence. Was it betrayal to smile with the enemy? That question haunted her. Their officers had drilled loyalty deeper than hunger. Defeat was supposed to erase laughter forever. Yet here she was, clutching a ball given by those who destroyed her city. The candle hissed as a mosquito brushed the flame. Somewhere outside, she heard the low hum of an American generator, then a few voices, someone retelling the afternoon's game, laughter rising again. Diaries recovered from POW archives describe this exact contradiction. Emotional confusion, one doctor called it. Reports note sleeplessness, guilt, even nightmares triggered by simple acts of kindness. In this camp, the women were living that paradox, safe but uneasy, fed but hollow. The baseball symbolized both their captivity and their fragile rediscovery of life. The nurse pressed the ball against her chest. It was still warm from the day's sun, its leather rough under her fingers. Were we still enemies if they fed us? She whispered. No one answered. Outside, rain began to fall, drumming against the tin roofs, drowning the day's echoes into one soft rhythm. Through the thin walls, she could faintly hear something muffled voices, a sudden shout, another crack. The Americans were playing again, even in the downpour. She rose, walked to the hut's doorway, and looked out into the storm. They were still out there, laughing in the rain as if the war had never existed, and something inside her began to shift. The rain didn't stop for 2 days. It fell in heavy sheets that blurred the camp's edges, washing the dust into rivers that ran between the huts. Yet even through the downpour, the Americans kept playing. The steady rhythm of bat against ball mixed with the hiss of rain, turning the sound into something almost musical. From the doorway of her hut, the nurse watched them, her arms folded tight against the cold. Each swing sent droplets flying like shards of glass through grey air. One soldier slipped and fell, mud splashing his uniform, and the others burst out laughing. There was no anger, no scolding, just laughter echoing off the soaked ground. The nurse felt her lips curve without permission. It was absurd, almost childlike, and yet something about their persistence in the rain struck her deeply. These men weren't playing for victory. They were playing to remember who they were before they learned to hate. Rain pooled near the fence, reflecting flickers of movement like ghosts from another world. The nurse stepped closer, barefoot, water soaking her hem. Through the blur she saw the familiar face, the same soldier who had first tossed her the ball. He waved. She hesitated, then lifted her hand back, a small gesture invisible to most, but enough to crack the last layer of fear. Military records describe similar scenes across Pacific camps in late 1945. Morale officers wrote of psychological recovery rituals of moments when repetition and physical rhythm helped both prisoners and guards process the trauma of years of war. Baseball wasn't just pastime, it was therapy disguised as play. They did not fear the rain, one woman later recalled, and maybe they did not fear us. That line became symbolic of the strange peace forming in those muddy fields. The rain thinned to drizzle. The soldiers stopped to rest under a tarp. One pointed toward the women's huts, motioning for them to join. The invitation hung in the mist, half gesture, half miracle. The nurse looked back at her companions, uncertain. Then, without a word, she stepped forward into the open rain. Tomorrow, she would cross the fence again, not as a captive, but as a teammate. The next morning the sun returned, fierce and white, burning steam off the soaked earth. The smell of mud and wet canvas hung thick in the air. The nurse and a few other women stood by the fence again, only this time. The gate was already open. The American guard waved them through with an easy nod, his rifle resting casually against the post. For the first time, they crossed into the field without being counted or commanded. The field was still slick with puddles. American boots left deep prints beside their bare feet. The nurse hesitated until one of the soldiers, Mud, streaked and grinning, pointed at the bat, then at her. She shook her head quickly. He laughed, handed it to her anyway, and stepped behind to show her the stance. He didn't touch her, he just mimed the movement slowly, patient, almost teacher-like. She copied him, adjusting her hands along the smooth wooden handle. When she swung, the ball missed by a mile, skipping through the mud. The men cheered anyway, a warm roar that made her blush and laugh at once. Another soldier jogged forward, retrieved the ball and gestured again. Try, he said simply. The word, though foreign, landed clearly. She swung again, better this time, and the ball smacked against the wet ground, rolling fast toward the fence. Applause erupted. Someone shouted, "She's got it." The nurse bent forward, laughing uncontrollably, rain still dripping from her hair. In that instant, hierarchy dissolved completely. There were no prisoners, no victors, only people learning to exist in the same space without hatred. Camp logs from Allied records mention that 12 Pacific camps hosted, shared recreation, events between 1945 and 1946. Most were brief, cautious, undocumented, but survivors later recalled those afternoons as the first time they saw Americans as human, and themselves as forgiven. They cheered for me, not at me. One account reads, "The nurse would remember that feeling for the rest of her life." The laughter, the mud, the strange brightness of the day when enemies stopped performing war. As the sun began to fade, the soldiers packed up their gloves and bats. Yet no one moved toward the gate. The nurse and her companions lingered, tossing the ball gently between them, their laughter now blending with the Americans' voices. The day wasn't ending. It was only widening. Weeks passed, and the game became part of camp life. An unofficial ritual stitched between chores, roll calls, and ration lines. What began as a curiosity had grown into rhythm. Every few days the women joined the soldiers in the yard, fielding soft pitches, chasing slow grounders, laughing at missed catches. Even guards who never smiled before now clapped from the sidelines. For the first time since surrender, the camp felt alive. One morning, the nurse was sorting laundry near the mess hall when a courier truck arrived. Soldiers crowded around it as mailbags were unloaded. Minutes later, an American officer walked toward her holding something flat and brown. An envelope. She stared at it, confused. Inside was a small photograph, her mid-swing, hair tied back, the baseball frozen just before contact. Behind her, Americans grinned in the background, half cheering, half posing. On the bottom corner, someone had scrawled in pencil, "For our teammate." Her throat tightened. She hadn't realized anyone had taken a picture. Around her, other women were receiving similar photographs, smiling faces, muddy fields, shared laughter turned to proof. That night, she pinned hers above her cot using a sliver of wire. It was the first decoration in the hut that wasn't regulation, issued. Camp records note that by early 1946, nearly 40% of prisoners in Allied run facilities exchanged correspondence or small keepsakes with U.S. personnel before repatriation. It wasn't policy, it was memory preservation. The baseball games, the laughter, The simple gestures had become emotional landmarks in lives built on loss. Later that week, a Red Cross representative brought mail from Japan. Letters from families thought lost. The nurse clutched hers, hands trembling. It was from her mother, still alive, still waiting. She looked again at the photo taped to the wall, at her own captured smile. The contradiction burned. Grief and gratitude, shame and warmth, all tangled together. When release orders finally came, she packed the photo carefully between pages of her diary. "We carried those photos home like proof of another world," she wrote. It was proof that kindness could survive even in captivity, that the same hands that fought could also teach a game. At dawn, they lined up to leave. The nurse looked back one last time toward the field, where the bat still leaned against a post, waiting. Tokyo, 1949. The city buzzed again, streetcars clanging, vendors shouting, children running in alleys once filled with rubble. In a quiet park near Ueno, a familiar sound echoed across the afternoon air. Crack. A white ball sailed over dusty grass as schoolchildren shouted, "Safe." The nurse, now in her 30s, stopped on the path. The sound struck her chest like memory, raw, sudden, alive. She turned toward the field and saw boys in mismatched uniforms, one gripping a bat exactly as that American soldier once showed her. She stood there a long time. The war had ended 4 years ago, but inside her, its weight had never fully lifted until now. Baseball had survived the ruins. It was everywhere, in schools, in parks, even in factory breaks. Newspapers reported that by 1949, Japan hosted more than 600 organized leagues. The game that had begun in foreign soil, taught by men she'd feared, had become part of Japan's heartbeat. She sat on a bench listening. Every sound mirrored that Luzon camp. The rhythm, the laughter, the language that once terrified her now soft as rain. In her purse she still carried the photograph, a sun-bleached print of her first awkward swing. The edges had frayed, the ink faded, but the feeling it captured remained untouchable. A small boy missed his catch, the ball rolling near her feet. She picked it up automatically, turning it in her hands. The leather felt the same, rough, alive. The boy bowed and waited shyly. She smiled, tossed it back gently and watched it spin through the light. For a moment, time folded. She wasn't a prisoner or a survivor, just a witness to how peace could echo louder than war. Historians would later write that baseball became Japan's unofficial bridge to post-war America, a cultural handoff that replaced fear with fascination. But for her, it was simpler. The game had taught her that kindness could be stronger than command, that laughter could rebuild where loyalty once destroyed. As she rose to leave, another crack sounded behind her, sharp and clear. She didn't flinch this time. She smiled. Maybe, she thought, the war ended not with surrender, but with a game. And somewhere in that park, beneath the noise of children and city wind, the past finally exhaled.